Today, we will explore the remarkable life of Abraham Lincoln, a man who rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most important leaders in American history. Born in a small log cabin and largely self-taught, Lincoln faced countless hardships yet remained determined to learn, grow, and serve his country. From his early years on the frontier to his leadership during the nation's darkest hours, Lincoln's story is one of courage, honesty, and vision. He guided the United States through civil war, preserved the Union, and helped end slavery, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire millions around the world. Let's begin. Part 1. The early years of Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a small one-room log cabin on the frontier of Hardin County, Kentucky. His parents, Thomas and Nancy Lincoln, were hard-working farmers who owned very little but valued honesty and perseverance. They lived a rough, simple life, surrounded by thick woods and wild animals. When Abraham was still a boy, his family moved to southern Indiana and later to Illinois, searching for fertile land and a better future. Life on the frontier was harsh and uncertain. The Lincolns built their own shelter, hunted for food, and struggled against cold winters and sickness. These early experiences taught young Abraham the value of hard work, endurance, and courage. Lincoln's childhood education was extremely limited. In total, he probably attended less than a year of school. The teachers here were few and often poorly trained. Still, Lincoln loved learning. He was determined to educate himself. Even without formal schooling, he borrowed books from neighbors whenever he could, often walking miles just to read one. His favorite books included the Bible, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, and the life of George Washington. He would read by the light of the fireplace late into the night, writing notes on wooden boards or scraps of paper because he couldn't afford proper materials. People in his community soon noticed his hunger for knowledge. He was tall, thin, and awkward, but his intelligence and kindness earned him respect. He became known as Honest Abe because of his reputation for fairness. Once, he realized he had shortchanged a customer by a few pennies. Instead of ignoring it, he closed the shop and walked several miles to return the money. Stories like this spread across the town, and everyone trusted him completely. As he grew older, Lincoln worked a variety of jobs. He helped his father on the farm, split logs to make fences, worked as a flatboatman on the Mississippi River, and took any job that would help his family survive. Despite the physical labor, he remained curious about the world. He loved to tell jokes and stories, and he often entertained his friends with his humor and sharp wit. At the age of 21, Lincoln left his family home to start a life of his own in New Salem, Illinois. There, he worked as a store clerk and quickly became a favorite among the townspeople for his honesty, humor, and intelligence. Though the store eventually failed, Lincoln's time in New Salem was life-changing. He began reading about law, history, and government, often borrowing books from a local schoolteacher named Mentor Graham. These readings sparked his interest in politics and justice. In New Salem, Lincoln also joined local debates and community gatherings. He was shy at first, but his ability to speak clearly and logically soon made him a respected voice. People admired his calm temperament and sense of fairness. When a fight broke out or a disagreement turned heated, Lincoln was often the one who stepped in to make peace. He had a natural ability to connect with people from all walks of life, farmers, shopkeepers, or laborers, because he had lived their struggles himself. Those early years were not easy. Lincoln faced poverty, loss, and uncertainty. His mother died when he was just 9 years old, a moment that deeply affected him. His stepmother, Sarah Bush Lincoln, encouraged his love of reading and became one of the most important figures in his life. She once said that Abraham read everything he could lay his hands on, and that she knew he would grow into someone great. By the time Lincoln reached his mid-20s, he had developed into a thoughtful, self-educated young man with big dreams. He had experienced both hardship and hope, and these experiences shaped his compassion and strength. The boy from a log cabin was beginning to see a new world, one in which he might make a difference not only in his town, but perhaps in the entire nation. Part 2. The Road to Politics. After settling in New Salem, Abraham Lincoln's curiosity about law and government grew stronger. The people there admired his honesty, intelligence, and calm nature. They encouraged him to take part in local affairs. And soon he found himself drawn into politics. In 1832, at the age of 23, Lincoln decided to run for the Illinois state legislature. He had no real political experience, no money, and few connections, but he had ambition and a deep desire to help his community. In his campaign speech, Lincoln spoke about improving transportation, building roads, and supporting education. He wanted to make life better for ordinary people like the ones he had grown up with. However, before the election could take place, a new challenge appeared. The Black Hawk War broke out between the United States and a group of Native Americans. Lincoln volunteered to serve in the Illinois militia, though he never fought in a major battle. He was elected captain by his fellow soldiers, a sign of their respect and trust. Lincoln later joked that this was the only success he had in the war, but the experience taught him valuable lessons about leadership and responsibility. When the election finally came, Lincoln lost, but instead of giving up, he saw it as a learning experience. He returned to New Salem and began studying law more seriously. He borrowed books from a local lawyer and taught himself by reading late into the night. In between, he worked at different jobs, surveyor, postmaster, and store clerk, to support himself. People admired his persistence. No matter how hard life became, Lincoln never stopped working toward his goal of becoming a lawyer and helping others. In 1834, Lincoln ran for the Illinois legislature again, and this time he won. He was only 25 years old. As a member of the Whig Party, he believed in progress, building railroads, improving education, and developing the economy. During his time in the legislature, Lincoln began to earn a reputation for his careful reasoning and clear, honest speech. He always tried to understand both sides of an issue before making a decision. While serving in Springfield, Lincoln met many important people who would shape his future. One of them was John Todd Stewart, a lawyer who encouraged him to practice law professionally. Lincoln studied hard, passed the bar exam in 1836, and began working as an attorney in Springfield. He quickly became known for his fairness and skill in court. His clients trusted him because he never cheated or exaggerated. He spoke simply and directly, using plain language that ordinary people could understand. Lincoln's personal life was also changing. Around this time, he met Mary Todd, a well-educated young woman from a respected Kentucky family. Mary admired Lincoln's intelligence and sense of humor, while he was drawn to her wit and strong will. They married in 1842, despite some early doubts and differences in background. Together, they would face both great joy and deep sorrow, raising 4 sons, only one of whom, Robert, would live to adulthood. As Lincoln's career advanced, he became more involved in national politics. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1846, where he served a single term. In Washington, he spoke out against the Mexican-American War and criticized what he saw as unnecessary aggression by the government. His position was unpopular, and when his term ended, he chose not to run again. Instead, he returned to Springfield and focused on his law practice. For several years, Lincoln stayed away from politics. Yet, the growing debate over slavery was beginning to divide the nation. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery, deeply disturbed him. He saw slavery as morally wrong and feared that its spread would destroy the Union. This issue would pull him back into public life and set him on the path to becoming one of America's greatest leaders. Part 3. The return of politics and the fight against slavery by the mid-1850s The issue of slavery was tearing the United States apart. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 had allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether they would permit slavery, overturning the earlier Missouri Compromise that had limited its expansion. Violence soon broke out in Kansas, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed in bloody conflict. Across the nation, people took sides. Abraham Lincoln, who had stayed mostly quiet in politics for years, could not remain silent any longer. Lincoln was not an abolitionist in the beginning. He did not call for the immediate end of slavery everywhere. However, he believed strongly that slavery was morally wrong and should not be allowed to spread into new territories. In a speech in Peoria, Illinois in 1854, he made his views clear. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. He argued that the Founding Fathers had intended for slavery to gradually disappear and that expanding it would betray America's promise of freedom. His words struck a deep chord with many who felt the same unease about the nation's direction. That same year, Lincoln helped form a new political movement, the Republican Party. It was created by people who opposed the spread of slavery and who wanted to promote free labor, free land, and free men. Lincoln quickly became one of the party's rising stars in Illinois. His speeches were clear, emotional, and logical. He spoke in a way that ordinary people could understand, yet his ideas carried moral weight and power. In 1858, the Republican Party chose Lincoln to run for the U.S. Senate against the famous Democrat Stephen A. Douglas. The race became one of the most important political contests in American history. During the campaign, the two men held a series of debates across Illinois, 7 in total, that drew huge crowds and national attention. The Lincoln-Douglas debates focused mainly on the issue of slavery and its expansion. Douglas argued that each territory should decide for itself whether to allow slavery, a concept he called popular sovereignty. Lincoln, however, took a firmer moral stance. He declared that the nation could not endure permanently half slave and half free. A house divided against itself cannot stand, he said in one of his most famous speeches. He warned that if slavery continued to spread, it would eventually corrupt the entire Union. Although Lincoln lost the Senate election, the debates made him famous across the country. Newspapers reprinted his speeches, and many Americans began to see him as a man of principle and courage. He had not won the seat, but he had gained something far more valuable: national recognition. As the 1860 presidential election approached, the United States was more divided than ever. The South feared that a Republican president would threaten their way of life, while the North grew increasingly resistant to the power of the slave-holding states. Within this storm of conflict, Lincoln's reputation as an honest, moderate, and moral leader stood out. He was seen as someone who could unite the North and restore a sense of purpose to the nation. Lincoln accepted the Republican nomination for president in 1860. In his speeches, he promised not to abolish slavery where it already existed, but to stop its expansion into new territories. His message appealed to voters who wanted to preserve the Union and prevent further conflict. When the election came, Lincoln won with strong support from the northern states, though he received almost no votes in the South. His victory shocked the southern states. Even before he could take office, several of them, starting with South Carolina, began to secede from the Union. They saw his election as proof that their rights and their institution of slavery were no longer safe. By the time Lincoln prepared to travel to Washington, D.C., in early 1861, the nation he was about to lead was already breaking apart. Part 4. The nation divides and the Civil War begins when Abraham Lincoln was elected president in November 1860. The United States was already deeply divided. His victory made him the first Republican president in history, but it also pushed the South to the edge of rebellion. Before he could even take office, 7 southern states, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, announced they were leaving the Union. They claimed that Lincoln and the Republicans were enemies of their rights, especially their right to keep slaves. These states soon formed their own government, the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as president. Lincoln faced the greatest crisis any American president had ever seen. When he arrived in Washington, D.C., in March 1861, rumors of assassination plots surrounded him. His journey to the Capitol. "I was made secretly at night for safety." In his first inaugural address, Lincoln tried to calm the fears of the South. He promised that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed, but firmly declared that no state had the right to leave the Union. "We are not enemies, but friends," he said, urging Americans to remember their shared history and hopes. But his words were not enough. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter, a U.S. military base in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The bombardment lasted for more than a day until Fort surrendered. The Civil War had begun. The news spread quickly across the country, and both sides prepared for a long, bloody conflict. Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteers to defend the Union. For more states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, joined the Confederacy, while the rest of the nation braced for war. In the early months of the conflict, Lincoln struggled to find capable military leaders. The Union Army suffered several defeats, including the disastrous Battle of Bull Run, where untrained troops fled in panic. Many doubted whether Lincoln was strong enough to lead the nation through such chaos, but he refused to give up. He spent long hours studying maps, learning military strategy, and communicating directly with his generals. His goal was clear: to preserve the Union at any cost. Lincoln's challenges were not only military, but also political. Many people in the North were divided about the purpose of the war. Some wanted a quick peace, even if it meant letting the South go its own way. Others demanded the immediate end of slavery everywhere. Lincoln had to balance these forces carefully. He often said that if he could save a Union without freeing a single slave, he would do it. But if he could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, he would do that too. His main aim, at least in the beginning, was to keep the nation together. At home, the war created hardship and sorrow. Thousands of young men left their farms and families to fight, and many never returned. Lincoln felt the pain of every loss deeply. He visited soldiers in hospitals, spoke to grieving families, and often stayed up late at night reading lists of the dead. The burden of leadership weighed heavily on him, and his face began to show the toll: deep lines, gray hair, and tired eyes. Despite the suffering, Lincoln never lost his sense of compassion. He believed that both sides were caught in a tragedy bigger than themselves. He also began to see more clearly that the war was about something greater than just preserving the Union. It was about freedom. As the conflict dragged on, Lincoln's thoughts turned increasingly toward the question of slavery and what ending it might mean for the nation's soul. Part 5. The Emancipation Proclamation and Turning the Tide by 1862. The Civil War had grown longer and bloodier than anyone expected. Both the Union and the Confederacy suffered terrible losses, and neither side seemed close to victory. Abraham Lincoln felt the weight of every death. He visited the front lines, met with generals, and read reports late into the night. Behind his calm expression, he was constantly searching for a way to end the conflict and heal the nation. As the war continued, Lincoln's thinking about slavery began to evolve. At first, his goal had been only to preserve the Union, but as he saw the devastation of war and the courage of enslaved people escaping to Union lines, he began to realize that slavery itself was at the heart of the conflict. The South depended on enslaved labor to support its war effort. Freeing the slaves would not only strike a moral blow against the Confederacy, but also weaken its economy and military power. In the summer of 1862, Lincoln made one of the hardest and most important decisions of his life. He decided to issue an order freeing the slaves in all states that were in rebellion against the Union. His cabinet was divided. Some feared it would anger the border states that still allowed slavery, but remained loyal to the Union. Others worried that the public was not ready for such a radical step. Lincoln listened carefully, but his mind was made up. "I have made a promise to myself," he said. "I shall keep it." He waited, however, for a Union victory to give his decision more strength. That opportunity came after the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, one of the bloodiest single days in American history. More than 22,000 soldiers were killed or wounded, but the Union Army held its ground. Lincoln used the moment to act. On September 22, 1862, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, announcing that if the Confederate States did not return to the Union by January 1, 1863, their slaves would be declared free. When the deadline passed, Lincoln signed the final Emancipation Proclamation. It did not free slaves in the loyal border states, but it changed the meaning of the war forever. The struggle was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now a fight for human freedom. Lincoln later said, "If my name ever goes down in history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." The proclamation also allowed African American men to join the Union Army. Thousands of formerly enslaved men volunteered to fight for their own freedom. They served bravely in many battles, proving their courage and loyalty to the Union cause. Their contribution gave new strength to the Northern armies and added moral purpose to the war effort. Internationally, the Emancipation Proclamation had a powerful effect. European nations like Britain and France, which had considered supporting the Confederacy, could no longer do so without appearing to defend slavery. Lincoln's decision isolated the South diplomatically and strengthened the Union's position abroad. Still, the fighting went on. The war entered its third year, and both sides were exhausted. In 1863, Lincoln faced criticism from many directions. Some said he was too harsh. Others said he was too soft. Yet he remained steady, guided by his deep belief in democracy and equality. "This nation," he said, "was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." That summer, the war reached a turning point at the Battle of Gettysburg, where Union forces defeated General Robert E. Lee's army in a massive 3-day battle. The victory came at terrible cost. More than 50,000 soldiers were killed or wounded, but it gave Lincoln new hope that the Union could still prevail. Later that year, in November 1863, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a new national cemetery for the fallen soldiers. His speech, only a few minutes long, became one of the most famous in American history, the Gettysburg Address. In it, Lincoln reminded the nation that the war was a test of whether a government of the people, by the people, for the people could endure. He urged Americans to ensure that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that the country would experience a new birth of freedom. Part 6. Trials of Leadership in the Road to Victory by 1864. The Civil War had entered its fourth year, and the strain on Abraham Lincoln was immense. The nation was weary of bloodshed. Families were torn apart, and the outcome still seemed uncertain. Yet, despite enormous pressure, Lincoln refused to give up his determination to preserve the Union and now, to ensure freedom for millions of enslaved people, gave him strength to carry on. Lincoln faced constant challenges, not just from the battlefield, but from politics and public opinion. Many in the North were growing impatient. Casualties continued to rise, and victories were rare. Critics accused him of being too cautious or too radical. Newspapers mocked him, and political rivals plotted against him. Even members of his own party doubted that he could win re-election. In the summer of 1864, Lincoln himself feared he might lose the presidency. Still, he chose honesty over ambition. He told his cabinet that if he lost, he would cooperate fully with the next president to save the Union before leaving office. Meanwhile, Lincoln had found a general who shared his relentless resolve, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was not elegant or polished, but he was determined and fearless. Unlike previous Union generals, he was willing to fight hard and accept heavy losses if it meant victory. Lincoln respected Grant's courage and gave him full authority over the army. Together, they formed a powerful partnership that would eventually bring the war to an end. As Grant's forces fought in Virginia, another Union general, William Tecumseh Sherman, led a bold campaign in the South. In 1864, Sherman captured Atlanta, Georgia, a major Confederate stronghold. The victory lifted the spirits of the North and turned the tide of public opinion. Lincoln's chances for re-election improved dramatically. The message was clear. The Union was beginning to win. That November, Lincoln was re-elected as President of the United States. His victory was seen as a sign that the American people still believed in his leadership and in the cause of freedom. In his second inaugural address, delivered in March 1865, Lincoln spoke not with triumph, but with humility and sorrow. He reflected on the terrible cost of the war and the deep wounds it had caused. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he said, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Grant's army surrounded General Robert E. Lee's forces in Virginia, cutting off supplies and escape routes. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered to Grant. After 4 years of brutal fighting, the Civil War was finally over. The Union had been preserved, and slavery, the issue that had divided the nation for so long, was coming to an end. Lincoln's joy was quiet and solemn. He did not celebrate or seek revenge against the South. Instead, he focused on peace and healing. He urged Americans to forgive, to rebuild, and to remember that they were one people again. When Union soldiers paraded through Washington in triumph, Lincoln stood quietly, tears in his eyes. "Thank God we have won the war," he said softly. "Now we must win the peace." But even as he dreamed of a reunited nation, dark shadows still surrounded him. The war had left behind anger, bitterness, and despair. Many in the South refused to accept defeat, and hatred toward Lincoln grew among extremists who saw him as a destroyer of their way of life. He did not know it, but his greatest victory would soon be followed by his greatest tragedy. Part 7. The tragedy of assassination. The Civil War ended in April 1865, and for the first time in years, Abraham Lincoln felt a sense of peace. The Union had been saved, and slavery was dying. Cities had been divided, but hatred began to see hope again. Lincoln spent his last week speaking of rebuilding the South and reuniting the nation, with malice toward none, with charity for all. His dream was not to punish the former Confederates, but to bring them back as equal citizens in a stronger, freer United States. At home, life also seemed brighter. The Lincolns moved into the White House in 1861 burdened by war and worry, but by 1865, the atmosphere had lightened. Lincoln's youngest son, Tad, was his joy, and Mary Todd Lincoln felt proud of her husband's triumph. On April 9th, when General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, crowds filled the streets of Washington to celebrate. Church bells rang, soldiers cheered, and people shouted Lincoln's name. Yet the president remained humble. "We must be kind," he told those around him. "Let us have no bitterness toward the defeated." In those days, Lincoln spoke often of the future. He wanted to rebuild the South through education and fair laws, not revenge. He also looked forward to enjoying simple pleasures, time with his family, visiting the theater, and perhaps even traveling to the West after leaving office. Friends later recalled that he seemed unusually cheerful in the days before his death, as if a great burden had finally lifted from his heart. But not everyone shared his vision of peace. In the shadows, a group of Confederate sympathizers plotted revenge. Among them was John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor and passionate supporter of the South. Booth blamed Lincoln for the South's defeat and for the end of slavery. He believed that by killing the president, he could inspire Confederacy to rise again. On the evening of April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln and Mary attended a play called Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The president loved the theater. It was one of the few places where he could relax and forget the pain of war. That night, he was in a joyful mood, laughing and holding his wife's hand as the actors performed. Shortly after 10 p.m., Booth slipped into the presidential box where Lincoln sat. He waited for a line in the play that always drew laughter, then fired a single bullet into the back of the president's head. Lincoln collapsed unconscious. Booth shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," Latin for "thus always to tyrants," and leapt onto the stage before fleeing the theater. Panic swept through the audience, but the wound was fatal. He was carried across the street to a small boarding house, where he lay unconscious through the night. Cabinet members, soldiers, and friends stood by his side, weeping silently. Mary Todd Lincoln, overcome with grief, could not stay in a room for long. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln took his final breath. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, tears in his eyes, said softly, "Now he belongs to the ages." The news of Lincoln's death spread rapidly across the country. Bells tolled in every city, and people wept openly in the streets. The man who had led the nation through its darkest hour was gone. Even many in the defeated South mourned his passing, realizing that the one leader who had offered forgiveness was no more. Lincoln's body was taken by train from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, stopping at cities along the way so Americans could pay their last respects. Millions stood beside the tracks in silence as his funeral train passed. Flowers, flags, and tears marked his long journey home. In Springfield, he was buried near his childhood home, the simple, peaceful resting place of a man who had risen from humble beginnings to change the course of history. Part 8. Legacy and Memory After Abraham Lincoln's Death. The United States entered a period of mourning unlike any it had ever known. Millions of people, both in the North and the South, grieved not only for the man, but for what he represented. The spirit of unity, justice, and compassion that had held the nation together through its greatest trial. Black and white Americans alike lined the streets to watch his funeral train pass, some weeping openly, others standing in solemn silence. Many felt as though they had lost a father. Lincoln's assassination shocked the world. Foreign leaders sent letters of sympathy, praising his courage and humanity. In Europe, newspapers described him as the savior of democracy. In the United States, the sense of loss was overwhelming. People placed black cloths on their doors, schools closed, and churches held memorial services. Yet even in grief, Americans began to reflect on what Lincoln's life had meant and what his death might teach them. He had led the nation through its most terrible conflict, preserved the Union, and ended slavery. But his legacy went beyond those achievements. Lincoln had shown that leadership could come from humility, patience, and moral strength rather than pride or power. He had risen from poverty, taught himself through determination, and believed deeply that every person deserved respect and opportunity. His story became a symbol of the American dream, the idea that anyone, no matter how humble their beginnings, could rise to greatness through honesty and hard work. After his death, Reconstruction began, the long, difficult process of rebuilding the South and redefining the nation. Lincoln had hoped for a peaceful and fair reunion, but without his guidance, the country faced many struggles. The years that followed were filled with political battles, racial violence, and deep division. Yet the ideals Lincoln had fought for, equality, liberty, and democracy, continued to inspire those who came after him. In 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, officially abolishing slavery throughout the United States. It was a fulfillment of Lincoln's most sacred promise, that America would become a nation where no man could own another. Later, the 14th and 15th Amendments granted citizenship and voting rights to former slaves, expanding the freedom Lincoln had dreamed of. Over time, Lincoln's memory became a guiding light for generations. His speeches, especially the Gettysburg Address and his second inaugural address, were studied by students, quoted by leaders, and cherished by ordinary people. They reminded Americans of the values that define their nation: equality, compassion, and the belief that government must serve the people. Monuments and memorials soon rose in his honor. The most famous, the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., was completed in 1922. Inside, a massive statue of Lincoln sits in quiet dignity, his expression calm but thoughtful. On the walls are carved the words of his greatest speeches, words that continue to echo through time. Millions visit each year to reflect on his life and to remember the cost of freedom. Around the world, Lincoln remains one of the most admired figures in history. He is celebrated not only as a leader who ended slavery, but also as a symbol of humanity and justice. Writers, artists, and filmmakers have told his story countless times, yet his character always feels fresh and relevant. His honesty, humility, and deep faith in democracy speak to people of every age and culture. Today, more than a century and a half after his death, Abraham Lincoln's spirit still lives on in the ideals of freedom and equality that guide the United States. His journey, from the poor boy reading by the firelight to the president who saved a nation, reminds us that greatness is not measured by power or wealth, but by integrity, compassion, and courage. Lincoln once said, "I am not bound to win, but I am bound to be true." Those words define his life and his legacy. He may have fallen by an assassin's hand, but his vision of a united and just America continues to inspire people everywhere. The man from the log cabin became not just a leader of his time, but a timeless symbol of hope, a light for a world still striving toward the freedom and fairness he believed in so deeply. Abraham Lincoln's life shows us that even in the face of great challenges, integrity, perseverance, and compassion can change the world. From a poor boy in Kentucky to the president who preserved the nation, Lincoln proved that courage and honesty matter more than wealth or status. His words, action, and vision for a free and united country continue to inspire people of all ages and backgrounds. By remembering his life and legacy, we are reminded of the power of hope, the importance of justice, and the enduring value of standing up for what is right.